Hello, welcome to English Champion. On this episode, we are discussing the state of journalism based on a report that came out about 6 weeks ago. I've been doing so much other writing in the meantime that I wasn't able to get to this, but I felt like I needed to talk about this, especially this week, because of the latest developments from the world of journalism. And it's not really an article, it's more of a manifesto or a position paper by a few professors of journalism at a major university with one of the most recognizable and well-known names attached as the School of Journalism in the country. And the report they filed was called Beyond Objectivity, Producing Trustworthy News in Today's Newsrooms. I'll let you look it up for yourself. I won't mention the name of the university, but you can find it on your own. And it's about a 25-page document that I've gone through pretty carefully, and I want to share some components of that with you. It's very interesting. Again, the title, Beyond Objectivity, and the piece basically argues that, very poorly argues, I will say, it's very poorly written. This is a document that wouldn't really make it out of my undergraduate writing classes. It's very confusing in places, contradictory, horrible logic, which is what I'm going to point out to you. Just an overall lack of clarity, really. But really it argues that objectivity is no longer a fundamental goal of journalism, or it really shouldn't be. And we're going to look at the arguments they make and the errors they also make along the way. I am someone who runs a program that in which journalism is housed at my institution. So I have a vested interest in and a responsibility for the future generation of journalists. And so this is an important topic, and I fear where this is headed. This has been going on for quite a while in the culture, and these gentlemen who wrote this document have put it on paper for all to see. And so that's what we're going to take a look at today. So the opening of the document describes creating a new set of standards for trustworthy news. Now, what the document is very sort of fuzzy on is separating out news from other forms of journalism, human interest stories, op-ed pieces, other types of opinion writing or perspective writing. And so it sort of lumps all of it together when really it should be separating these out. And that's part of what adds to this confusion. The big critical stance it takes, if it does that, is that objectivity is ineffective because it often leads to this fake sense of balance, or what they call both sidesism, where to be objective in journalism, we need to present both sides no matter what. And that is a position that is sort of true, but also has some exceptions to it. And that's what we can go into here as well. This, they say, is especially dangerous when covering issues, they say, quote, like climate change or the intensifying assault on democracy. And it gives a lot of, it gives as examples a lot of positions like that. You can sort of tell right from the get-go what political or ideological stance these authors take. But basically what they're assuming here is that there are certain matters that are completely settled, and therefore we don't need to talk about both sides of that issue. And again, that's sort of right. No one is saying that, to use a silly example, if you're writing a piece about how the earth is round, you probably don't need to go get a perspective of a flat earther just so you can say you've been objective in your reporting. All right. We agree there are certain topics that everyone knows it's completely confirmed that things are true. And yeah, we don't need to get the opposing side on something that is admittedly ridiculous. But these authors, and I think they speak for a lot of people in journalism today, based on what we've seen, especially the last 3 years, if not longer than that, where we just assumed matters are settled, that there is nothing else to discuss. There isn't another side. Everyone automatically agrees with this position. Therefore, there's no need to look any further. And that is simply not true. And we're going to talk about a couple of those issues as we go here. It also is at the beginning of the article or the piece says that some news media reformers deride objectivity as an unachievable or misleading goal. This is a little trick that you see a lot of people do where they say, some people say this. Well, just admit that that's you saying it. All right. You're trying to pretend that there are other people talking about this when this is your argument. So just stand by it and, stop pretending that you are trying to be fair when, as I'll show you here as we go through this, you're not being very fair here. Some say trick by journalists to act like they're being fair when they definitely aren't. They would be better off just admitting what they're trying to do here. Several times throughout the piece, they reference surveys consistently showing that most news consumers want journalism that is free of bias. Now, what you'll see as we go through this is that they're advocating for bias. All right. They are saying that we can't avoid it. It's part of human nature. And so therefore, we're going to try to mitigate it, but we also know that people are people and it's going to come out. So we just got to admit it. Well, that's part of the problem. All right. Is when we say, this is what people want, but we're going to do something else instead. And that becomes very obvious throughout the document. References, they want insights from best practices and best practitioners across a variety of media and news organizations. How exactly this is possible doesn't really, it tries to offer solutions to that, but it ultimately lands on, well, who decides what's best? How does anyone decide what the best practices are, or who the best practitioners are? As with most things in the journalism and media space, well, it's whoever they agree with, right? That's who they're going to deem to be the best. And ultimately what they want, and this is the kicker, they dive into this a little more deeply towards the end of the piece. They want to move beyond accuracy to truth. Move beyond accuracy to truth, as if you can reach truth without being accurate, when really it should be, we need to use accuracy to achieve truth. That's what real journalists would do. You use what's accurate, what's factual, to then reach something truthful. This is saying we need to go beyond that. We don't necessarily need all these facts. We don't need to necessarily always be accurate. We're just trying to find, quote, the truth. And we're going to see what they deem as being truthful as we go. And it's exactly what you would probably assume. Now they start after the introduction. They give a little bit of background, and it's very interesting because the basic premise of this objective form of journalism they talk about comes from early 20th century, where, especially following or during World War I, the push of government propaganda became much more noticeable and proliferated. And this was also the time where marketing and advertising really jumped. And so that there's this public relations, marketing, advertising environment that journalists were a bit afraid of. And they said, wait a second, the government is trying to push out information that isn't necessarily trustworthy. And we know people who are in advertising and marketing aren't doing things that are trustworthy because they have their own, profit motives and other incentives, of course. So we need to develop journalism as a way of being as fact-based, disinterested, fair-minded as possible. And you think, well, yeah, that's exactly what it should be. You want to be fair so that you're not influenced by government propaganda or sort of the capitalistic onslaught of marketing and advertising and PR. Makes total sense. And yet, this is what they're sort of pushing back against. Why you would not want to push back against government propaganda or the influence of companies who just want to sell you things makes no sense to me. And based on the report they write, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to them either. Again, repeated references to readers saying they expect news media to report both sides of stories. Now, there are no internal citations in this document, so it's a little tricky to figure out where they're getting these surveys. There is a list of sources at the back of the project, but it's a bit hard to find what their references actually are. But again, let's assume that what they're saying here is true, and this is potentially what readers want. What they are going to argue is that we shouldn't give readers both sides of the story because both sidesism isn't truthful enough. All right. So this is where they're going to land. Now, we can see the bias in this piece right from the beginning because in a very brief sentence, you get a clear picture of who these folks are. where they're saying that new challenges to the status quo of journalistic objectivity came with cable television, and then more profoundly, the internet. Cable TV, which is outside federal regulation of over-the-air media, produced highly opinionated news networks, and here we go, including Fox News and others on the right, and MSNBC on the left. Let me just catch the bias here in the writing, all right? These opinionated news networks, including, notice the phrasing, Fox News and others on the right, and MSNBC on the left. All right, so they're pretending that there's this giant syndicate of Fox News and other right-wing outlets, and then there's this one lonely island of leftism called MSNBC. The way to be fair in writing this, the way to be objective and truly factual, could be to say there are highly opinionated news networks, including Fox News on the right and MSNBC on the left. You could say that, that's fine. Or you could say, including Fox, if you think there are others on the right, which that is a pretty tenuous argument, including Fox News and others on the right, for example, and MSNBC and others on the left. You can present both, and they both would be accurate. Instead, when you say there's a group on the right, but only one isolated example on the left, you're being unfair to the topic. That is pretty blatant and manipulative, and this happens throughout the piece. They go on to discuss how Americans have become more divided, of course, sort of picking and choosing what they want to believe from their various sources. And this, they say, it was greatly exacerbated by politicians and ideologues who demonize the mainstream news media as, quote, fake news. Now, they say politicians and ideologues, so they could mean those members of any party or any belief system. But by putting fake news in quotes, we know who they're talking about here, all right? And so we wonder, well, why did you pick that phrase exactly? Now, maybe they're using it as a catch-all, but again, there could be a variety of ways of putting that. They didn't necessarily have to say fake news, because if they meant that, if they intended for us to think that, well, all politicians and ideologues do this, throughout history, it's been people from all sides who have been very skeptical of news organizations for how they would report. They could have, as an example, again, back to the example I just gave, you could have said, exacerbated by politicians and ideologues who demonize the mainstream news media, such as Donald Trump, who repeatedly described organizations he didn't like as fake news, or the Obama administration, who also, on the record, called organizations they didn't like illegitimate or destructive to the country. Yet those phrases weren't included here. So again, picking and choosing certain language that we all know who is associated with a certain ideologue. Again, you're being unfair to the topic. And so this is the problem, is you're criticizing objectivity when you clearly don't even know how to be objective, because it's actually not that hard. Your phrasing could make it objective and fair, and everyone would agree with you. Which is exactly what you say people want. When you keep citing, surveys want people to be, organizations to be free of bias. Well, here's your chance to be free of bias. And in simple phrasing, you can't even do it. So this is a problem, again, that occurs throughout. And by the end of the introductory passage, they're very fearful because they say American society has been in upheaval over a variety of controversial topics. All right, American society has been in upheaval. Again, this is something I talk about with my freshmen. That is a generalization. I always tell my students, I have no idea who society is. Who are you talking about exactly? Which group of people? You talking about a small group of people? You talking about all of us? Who is this society exactly you're referring to? And then, everyone's been in upheaval. No, it's probably been a very small group. This is the same trick that people, if you see kind of clickbait headlines online that says, Twitter or the Twitter world reacts to whatever event has gone on. Like, no, that's not the world. That's like 0.1% of 1% of people who are actually, active users on Twitter. So when we use these generalizations, you're just undercutting the clarity of your position, and these are big problems. So the next section really gets into why they think objectivity is such a problem, and basically it boils down to the institution of journalism has for too long been governed by the standard argument, old white men. And objectivity is an old white male kind of construct. And it's not really fair to differing views. And and different realities, they say. What's funny is one person who is an award-winning journalist says, I'm not arguing for subjectivity. It's like, well, yeah, you are. If you're not arguing for objectivity, you're arguing for the opposite, which is subjectivity. And he says, I'm actually wholeheartedly endorsing objectivity as properly defined. The argument is that in practice, that's not what it is. Okay, so here's the premise that really exists throughout the whole document. It's, yes, it would be great if we could be objective, but that's not how reality is, so forget it. When really what we should be doing is saying, look, here's this ideal. Objectivity should be the ideal. That's what's the most fair and truthful and accurate. So therefore, since it's not working that way, let's work really hard on improving that, because that's the best way. He says, I'm not for subjectivity. Okay, great. So then fix the objectivity. If you see that as the problem, let's fix it. Because like I talked about this on the first podcast on processes, we want the best process. Well, the best process for news is objectivity. It just is, because again, it's the most fair and truthful and accurate and factual, and has the least. It's not impossible to be biased, but it tries to reduce it as much as it can. So that's the process we should be aiming at. And so instead, what these folks are doing is they're saying, well, this process that should be the best doesn't work, so we need to scrap it and do something else. It's like, no, improve the process. If that's the ideal, which it is, then work on it. Keep making it better. And instead, they don't really do that. Some white male newsroom leaders still use the word objectivity. This New York Times editor rejects its use to achieve neutrality or both sides balance because they don't reflect reality. It's interesting here because President Obama once referred to the golden age of objective journalism. So even he thought journalism was doing a pretty good job at one point. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But even from his ideological perspective, he valued objectivity at a certain point. And the fear that these stories, if you only focus on objectivity, that they don't reflect reality, it's like, well, isn't reality made up of a variety of complicated sides? They even admit that later on. It's like, well, that's the whole point of objectivity, is you recognize how complicated it is. You recognize that your side probably doesn't know everything. And so you need to go learn about the topic from as many angles as you can. And that's what you can present. And so when they're talking about reflecting reality, well, objectivity would be the best way of presenting reality. And yet that's what they are going to fight against here. They go on to say, defaulting to both sides' framing on divisive issues can be insufficient and misleading. Again, those are the issues that need the most both sides' framing. Anything that's divisive needs to be represented from all sides as fairly and as accurately as possible. Again, those are the ones that need the most objectivity. And yet they're saying, no, when you just default to reporting the both sides, it can be misleading. And again, it depends on what you're talking about. The issues here that are truly divisive, and if they're divisive by definition, it means there's large percentages of the population on equal sides, probably. If it's divided in two, well, it's probably 50-50 or some other large number on each side. Well, that's what you need to be fair. You need to talk about both sides. You need to talk to both sides. So then the same writer says, but the journalistic process needs to be objective and transparent. And we need to challenge ourselves and our readers to understand all the facts and explore a wider range of perspectives. So this happens throughout the piece where they say presenting both sides is insufficient and misleading, but we need to be objective and understand a wide range of perspectives. Like, well, wait a minute, you're contradicting yourself in the exact same paragraph. So these folks, they're trying to have it both ways. And there's a bunch of examples of that, which I'll share with you. It goes on to discuss this lady who used to be the head of the AP. Okay. So talk about a person in power. And yet she says, well, the objectivity usually has represented the view of the male white establishment. It's like, well, wait a second. You're the establishment, ma'am. You're a woman. You're the head of you were the head of AP. You are the establishment. So it's not just male, is it? Right. So these folks, they can't even see that they have influence. They could improve the system instead of trying to scrap it by getting rid of this idea of objectivity. She goes on to say it's objective by whose standards? And that standard seems to be white, educated, fairly wealthy guys. Again, just repeating the same talking point. And when people don't feel like they, excuse me, feel like they find themselves in news coverage just because they don't meet that definition. So another instance of just bad writing here. When people don't feel like they find themselves, it's because they don't meet that definition. You've got people, they, themselves, and they. All right, 4 words in one sentence that are completely unclear about who exactly you're talking about. All right, again, something I jump on my students all the time about. Tell me who exactly is saying this. Who do you mean exactly? Because we can't just go, well, people say, and they do this, and they feel this. Who exactly? So, and who exactly wants to find themselves in the news? I have no idea what that even means. I don't care who's giving the news. I don't need to see someone who looks like me giving the news. I want someone in the news who's telling me the truth and reporting all sides fairly and accurately. That's what I'm looking for. So I'm not exactly sure what this lady, the former head of AP, means. So they go on to talk about reinforcing this status quo in news coverage. The problem, again, from what I mentioned at the top, is these folks seem to be equating news coverage with other forms of journalism. And so he's a professor from university up in New York, School of Journalism. He says objectivity is a kind of a word of power because you're basically using it to tell other people, you can't say that, you're being an advocate, you're just being an advocate. It's like, well, yeah, that is what objectivity is supposed to do. It's supposed to say, you're not being fair to this topic. You need to rewrite this or represent your piece so that you're not being an advocate for either side of this issue. That's exactly what it's supposed to do. If you want to be an advocate, that might be okay, but that means your piece you're writing or the video you're making or whatever it is you're producing should be under the heading of opinion or perspective or editorial. So again, they sort of just blur the lines of news and then call everything journalistic news when these are very different things. They discredit the idea of view from nowhere, which is a traditional journalistic phrase. Another person says, I push to avoid the use of a term objectivity that can be used to detract from journalism's pursuit of the truth. Like, wait a second. How is being objective distracting or detracting from the pursuit of truth? I would argue being objective is the way to achieve the most amount of truth. So again, they're sort of conflating all of these words and, parsing them out when really these words are more similar to each other than they give them credit for. The journalist's job, one nonprofit news organization says, the journalist's job is truth, not objectivity. So if you're gonna make that claim, because all the rest of us normal people go, wait a minute, being objective is trying to be truthful, and you can't really have truth without some objectivity. You need to explain to us the difference. What do you mean by the difference between truth and objectivity? In that very same section, someone says, objectivity is not even possible. I don't even know what it means. So this is, if that sentence right there isn't indicative of what our culture has become, where someone says, that thing isn't real, it's impossible, but I also don't even know what that is. Right? So, like, I don't know what this thing is, but I know I don't like it. All right. So you're kind of reducing your credibility as someone who's trying to get at truth when you're criticizing something that you just admitted you don't even know what that word means. What this is really boiling down to is what various authors in the last couple of years have been describing as standpoint epistemology. This is a form of applied postmodernism where we're starting to get into the area what they're not going to explicitly say in this document, but this is what they're hinting at, is this idea of, well, my truth. It's like that everyone has their own truth, and therefore, since it's a form of truth, you should be allowed to write about it or talk about it. And that is horrible to say. Okay, there's the truth. Yes, people have different perspectives, but that doesn't mean. And the reason for that is, of course, because not everyone has access to all information. We only can see what we can see, and therefore we can only process what's available to us, and therefore that's what we go on. But the journalist's job is to go beyond that. It's to go beyond saying, well, here's what I saw, so this is what I'm going to report, to saying, yeah, here's what I saw, here's what I think is going on, but I want to make sure that I didn't misperceive it. I want to make sure that I'm not thinking about this unfairly. So let me go investigate further and see if I could have been wrong on my initial interpretation, and see if there's some other viewpoints on this so that I can make sure I'm accurate and not just reacting, or that I'm not just being overly persuaded by my own perceptual biases. That's the job of the journalist, at least the news journalist, is not to promote your truth. It's to take what you think to be true and investigate it and poke at it and even try to discredit it, like scientists are supposed to do, and then go, okay, based on all of the evidence I've gathered, I've looked at this thing from all types of angles. Here is what I think the truth is. And then that's your best effort, and that's fine. I think everyone would be okay with that. And then you allow other voices to also do the same investigation. So again, when we're starting to present the idea that, well, we need to present views because other people have forms of truth that haven't been listened to. It's like, well, yeah, maybe people haven't been listened to, but that doesn't mean what people are saying is true. We need to investigate. Just because someone says it, even in a very credible way, it doesn't mean it's right. We have to look at things more deeply and from more sides. The irony of all this is when we're, or one of the many ironies of all this, is that the school where these authors are based and where they've produced this manifesto is named after one of these old white males who, at least ostensibly, claimed to believe in objective journalism. So you're under the banner of this school, named after a guy who everyone knows was a journalist who everyone relied on. All right, he was a very trusted journalist years ago, and yet you're diminishing everything that he supposedly would have probably stood for. So irony abounds in this document. Objectivity was wrong. It was a failed concept, another author says. We pretended we were printing the truth when we were seeing the world through a certain lens. Well, but that's what everybody does. They're going to advocate that we need to have more lenses, but at the same time, they're criticizing people for having lenses. All right. So it's back to, how do you improve this situation? What they offer in this document is, well, we need to have more diversity of voices. Okay, that might be true, but you're just replacing one lens with another. How can one lens be bad, but this lens be good? What we should be doing is, yes, admitting we all have lenses, but then again, interrogating ourselves and interrogating the topic so deeply that the lens hopefully disappears, at least, if not entirely, at least most of the way. Instead, as the next section starts getting into, truly accurate reporting should be informed by people with their own backgrounds. Or sorry, objectivity prevents truly accurate reporting that's informed by people trying to display their own backgrounds, experiences, and points of view. So it's like, oh, that's truly accurate. Okay, so when people come at things with their own bias and their own perspectives, that's truly accurate. But looking at things from multiple sides and getting a more thorough sense of a topic, that's not accurate. All right. Got it. So that's the confusion that we're trying to deal with here in this document. These are these new journalists are willing to share their lived experiences. Again, that's that standpoint epistemology where, well, I lived it and I experienced it, therefore it's true. It's like, well, it's true in that you did experience that, but it doesn't mean your perspective on it is entirely accurate. It's your perspective. That doesn't necessarily qualify it as objective truth. Ultimately, what this gets down to is, how is that more fair than trying to legitimately look at things from multiple sides? The piece goes on to talk about these younger journalists who are attempting to match their personal views with the stories they cover. They are seeking more advocacy, which again, one of the commenters said, or will say, hey, we need to be careful of advocacy when that's exactly what they want. We should not be reflecting both sides, but instead what we see as reality. Again, all right, so from your viewpoint, you think what you're saying is real and what other people say isn't real. All right, so you get to decide what truth is. Got it. All right. There's a desire amongst these newer journalists to change the world. It's like, no, your job is not to change the world. Your job is to hold the world accountable. That's what your job is. As a journalist, if you're doing news anyway, it's to hold the world accountable by using facts so that your readers or viewers or whoever is listening to you can then decide how they want to deal with that, and maybe they can go change the world. Your job is to observe and report and hold accountable the world. That's it. Not your job is not to go change it. That's, opinion writer might do that. If you're going to put out a persuasive column, that's fine. But if you're doing news is not changing the world. You report so that other people can then go change the world. This other group no longer uses objectivity because it's become too political. It's become attacked as a word that is used to keep the status quo. Well, the status quo should be truth, right? Not your truth, not someone's perspective on truth, but the truth, as best as we can determine it. That's the status quo. So if you're mad at something for trying to keep that as the status quo, well, I'm sorry, but you're in the wrong. The article goes on to talk about how you achieve some of these ironically calling them objectives, these goals of having other points of view is through diversity. And of course, that leads to racial and gender quotas and things like this. But yet, what isn't examined deeply is real diversity, which would be diversity of political, religious, philosophical, intellectual diversity, people with a diversity of ideas. That would be real diversity. If you want to go down this path, rather than your racist, sexist quotas where you're just hiring people because you think, I want your point of view because you have a certain skin color or you're a certain gender or whatever. It would be better to hire people who might have that, but even better would be also having different intellectual points of view. The next section goes on to discuss how the personal lives of these journalists can be tricky because, they want to communicate with the world through social media that might be outside of the purview of their job requirements. And so, it seems a bit strange that these folks are having a problem with separating your work life from your personal life, because most of us do it all the time. There's all sorts of things. I don't take my personal life into my work. And I don't really take my work life into my personal life. So I don't really know how this would matter that much. But what one vice president of news, a news organization says, we have to have trainings and seminars, and we want people to be themselves and bring yourself to work and be comfortable. But we also have to be careful, because if you do that, it could be viewed as having a bias or a lack of ability to be objective when you're covering the news. It's like, yeah, that's what the problem is. Okay. When you say be yourself, have your perspective, use your identity to cover certain stories. It's like, well, okay, but that leads you to having a bias. Most jobs, you have to try your best, even though it's not perfect. We are subjective creatures in an objective world. Our biases do creep in, but good thinkers and good workers do our best to keep them separated. You want to constantly challenge yourself so you're not being influenced in that way. And these folks are of course wanting to express themselves in their own private social media accounts, on Twitter and things like that. But as one New York Times editor said, if you're doing that, it could possibly erode news consumers' trust in a news organization. It's like, yeah, that's exactly right. But that's also the opposite of what many of these journalists and editors were advocating previously. It's like, well, yeah, if you aren't objective, you're going to erode the consumer's trust in a news organization, which is exactly what you said the surveys want. That people want objectivity and fairness and non-biased reporting. And yet, when people are espousing their views on social media or taking up certain causes or being advocates, yeah, that hinders your ability to be a trustworthy, unbiased source of news information. So, there's another reporter who says conflicts of interest always need to be avoided, though journalists' life experiences and identities may make them the ideal person to tell a specific story. It's like, well, yeah, an opinion story, right, or a human interest story, that is fine, but not news stories. This one person, this is kind of a ridiculous statement. This person says, I bristle at the notion of objectivity. My lived experiences should inform what I cover. No, you cover what needs to be covered. You cover things that need to be exposed to the truth. You need to report the truth wherever it is, not just based on what your lived experience is. If that's all you're reporting on, you're going to miss all sorts of good stories that need to be told, that hold people accountable, that check people in power, because that's really the job of journalists. And if you're only focusing on, well, I want to do stories that align with my lived experience and my perspective, you're not a true news reporter, and you're not trustworthy because you're not truly considering valuable stories that desperately need the truth. The piece goes on really quickly. This was just something funny that wasn't really that important, but stood out. They're trying to address, well, how do you deal with this? How do you get more people involved? How do you make your newsrooms more diverse and equitable and all that stuff? And creating new avenues of communication and developing affinity groups and caucuses. Like, oh, okay, so segregation, right? You want to put people together who are all alike. That seems like the opposite of good journalism. You should want all different views discussing things all the time. And also, lastly, increasing numbers of staff meetings. Okay, good. Yeah, that's the way to get new journalists into the field, is advertise. When you come work for our company, we're going to have lots of staff meetings. I, as a person in the world of academia, I'm very familiar with the overwhelming number of meetings. And I always think of my hero, Thomas Sowell's quote, where he basically says, the least productive people are usually the ones holding the most meetings. That's usually how it goes. Most people who are truly productive think, when those ideas come up, yeah, I'm too busy. I'm doing important things. You guys go have your own meeting. I'm going to go do actual work. So I thought this is a way to help deal with this problem. Have more meetings. That would be great. Now, again, to contradict themselves, as they've been doing throughout this whole piece, one author said, this lady was from USA Today, there shouldn't be prohibitions against staff members working on stories involving their identities or life experiences unless they demonstrate a strong bias. It's like, that's their whole point, right? If you're going to focus on your own life experience, that is your bias. And so, again, you can't have it both ways. You can't say, be yourself, talk about things you want to talk about, bring your identity and experience to your job, but don't go overboard with it. Don't do it too much. Like, that's the whole point you brought them on, right? That's what you're advocating here. This other person adds, we want to tell important stories that individuals might be more knowledgeable about, but also with a team of people in those with systems in place. Your editors who are checking for facts, but also checking for fairness. Oh, like objectivity, isn't that's what you're looking for? That's the editor's job, is to hold the writer accountable, or the news person accountable, that you're being fair. So now we're back to objectivity. So again, I can't quite tell what these people are talking about, where they want independent life experience advocacy of stories, but also they realize, well, wait a minute, that could go too far. So we actually need to have some checks and balances here. Well, that check and balance is called objectivity. Stop fighting the thing you actually know you need. You're not making any sense. Again, they go on for a while about these stories that are from certain vantage points. Again, how do we know those are accurate? Just because something's from a person's vantage point doesn't mean it's factually accurate. And then kind of the kicker is we're allowing people to tell, here it is, their truth. What I mentioned before, this standpoint epistemology kind of thing, applied postmodernism, where, well, there is no real truth. There is no objectivity. We want people to tell their own interpretation of the truth. As long as, quote, as long as our facts are correct, they can tell their truth. Wait a minute. Isn't it just truth? If it's factual, that's truth. So how are you separating out? Well, as long as you have facts, you can tell your truth. Again, you've got to explain that to us. Person from NBC News says they want its journalists exerting influence, influencing policy and culture. Again, if you're a news organization, your job is not to exert influence or to influence policy. It's just report the facts, report the truth from as many different angles as you possibly can, so that we get a fairly clear picture of what is really happening. And then other people will take that and do what they want with it. Your job is not to go exert influence. So it gets towards the end of the document. They start to move towards, well, what can we do about this problem they perceive as a problem, objectivity. And some people said, well, I want a values-based journalism where we clearly state what we believe and what the premises from which we operate are. Well, it depends on if you're an advocacy organization, then yeah, you're going to have values that advocate. That's fine. But if you're a news organization, there are only a couple values. Your values as a news organization are free speech, meaning anyone should be able to report on anything that's factual and real and objective. Free speech. Equality under the law, meaning everyone gets treated fairly, and the people who have the most power, specifically government, or you could talk about major businesses if you want, those who control the most influence over the culture, they should be held accountable. They are equal under the law as well. If they're doing something wrong or illegal even, they should be called out on it. We should report the facts of what's going on. So freedom of speech, equality under the law, holding people accountable, and objective reporting, looking at things from as many different angles as we can so that we're being fair. Those are your values. There really aren't other values. All right. If you have other values beyond those, you are an advocacy organization. You can write stories, you can put out videos and news and pieces on the internet or YouTube or whatever, but you're not a news organization. News is fighting for free speech or protecting it by using it and holding people accountable who want to try to stop you from doing it, holding people accountable under the law, and being objective and as fair as you possibly can when you report the news. Those are the values. One lady, in describing the values of her organization, sort of points to what she says here, sort of is an indicator of where media and the culture really have ended up lately. And it's, she says, to me, it didn't feel like we were saying something that isn't kind of widely accepted. And what she's referring to is, we're gonna state a fact or something going on in the culture, and we assume that everyone kind of already accepts this. So we're not, we don't need to talk about the other side because everyone already knows this is true. So essentially what's happening is we're getting organizations that purport to be news, or doing, hard journalism, where they're just assuming everyone already knows things are the same, or that all the facts are the same and all the information is truthful. And so you just say it and you think, well, I don't have to cover the other side because everyone already knows this is how it is. Again, just because something is accepted or a certain group of people all have the same interpretation of certain events or of a certain story doesn't mean it's true. That's the job of the journalist. Your job is not to tell people what they already know or what you think they're going to agree with. Your job is to tell any story that has, value, that's important for people to know about based on what I talked about. That's a rooted in free speech and holding people accountable under the law. But also that it's not just in an echo chamber. You're trying to reach as many people as you can because that's what people need. People need the truth. So if you're only talking to your own select audience, well, how objective and how fair and how truthful can you possibly be? So at the end, the authors give this kind of list that's quite vague. This isn't really that helpful, but sort of here's your action items. Here's what you should do. And then first one is from the beginning that they talked about: strive not just for accuracy, but for truth. And here's how they explain it. If you're running an organization, your journalists must consider multiple perspectives to provide context where needed. Okay, that sounds like we're hinting towards objectivity and accuracy. That said, avoid lazy or mindless balance or both sides-ism. Well, who gets to decide what lazy or mindless is? Again, if you think everyone already knows something, well, that may not be true. There might actually be differing perspectives on these topics, and you actually need to cover both sides of it. But your reporting should combine accuracy and open-mindedness to multiple points of view and reflect the most honest picture of reality you can present. Again, that's objectivity. It's so funny that they're saying we need to get to the truth. And the way you get to it is by being accurate and open-minded and considering multiple perspectives. Yeah, we all agree with that. That's objectivity. And then you spend 25 pages saying objectivity doesn't work. So it's very confusing. What it also does is the contradictions here also kind of carry the assumption that some people can do this, but others can't. So in other words, If all your people are open-minded, which is what they should be, then there's no need for your various diversity quotas, racial, sex, or racial, gender, or even philosophical. You shouldn't need to go look for diversity because the diversity is within each individual journalist already. No matter who you are, you should have the diversity within you if you are committed to accuracy and open-mindedness and multiple points of view, which is what they're advocating for. So it's like you're assuming that only certain people can do that. And therefore, we need to hear from their side. So basically what you're doing is you're replacing objectivity, which all of your journalists should have, with a bunch of different journalists and all of their subjectivity. And you're kind of compiling all of them and saying, okay, these 50 people with all of their individual unique perspectives creates a sense of objectivity. When really, if you had 10 proper journalists who were actually objective and fair-minded and accurate and cared about the truth from multiple points of view, well, you wouldn't need all those extra people because you'd already have the diversity within the staff you already have. So this goes to a major problem with this whole document, which is you're really hiring the wrong people. If you're hiring people, if in the past people weren't being fair and open to multiple points of view and finding truth in a variety of places, well, those were bad journalists. You need to find better journalists, not journalists who just bring a certain point of view. You need to find journalists who are open to all those other points of view, who are being truly objective. So this is a hiring problem. The thing you're criticizing isn't you think it's a philosophical problem, and it's not. You're just finding bad journalists. And that's the problem. You're trying to fix something that is broken, like 12 steps down the line, where if you just go back to step 1 and solve it there, all of this I'm not going to say it would go away because we're still all flawed humans, but it would be dramatically improved. Fix the objectivity. Commit to the process that is truly the right process. And all these other things won't be as problematic down the line. It talks about recruiting, unlocking the power of diversity and inclusion and identity. Again, doesn't really address political, philosophical diversity in that way. Those are kind of conveniently left out of their depictions of what diversity would look like. They offer some again social media policies. Showing your work, being more transparent, which again, I think everyone would agree with. And then ultimately, the piece concludes with addressing the needs and aspirations of our increasingly diverse society more effectively than it has in the past. Again, I don't exactly know what that means. Our diverse society needs truth. That's what it needs. It doesn't need your truth. It doesn't need standpoint epistemology. It doesn't need someone's personal perspective. It needs the truth. And that's what journalists are supposed to be aiming at. So again, if you want to achieve that, great. We all agree with that, but that's the need and the aspiration of our society. Not just more views, more different perspectives for the sake of different perspectives. We need objectivity. That's the ultimate aspiration of the field of journalism. And then lastly, I just have to pick on this for a second because it's just so awful. The last sentences of the piece say, meeting that challenge of trying to rejuvenate journalism in their methodology here. Meeting that challenge will require the courage to contemplate change. Some of it incremental, some of it fundamental. The courage to contemplate change. Just, what a horrible phrase. Again, hiring better people would solve this problem. And this is the job of journalism schools. This piece is produced at a famous school of journalism, so they need to look inward. Because if you're training students to go gather different types of sources, to make connections in different neighborhoods and with different groups of people, that you've trained them on how to demonstrate fairness and challenge their own assumptions, well, then they're going to go get hired at these institutions and they're going to be able to do it there. So solve this problem at the school level, train better journalists, and then those institutions can hire better journalists, and then the field itself will be better. We're doing a bad job training them. And this is something in my program as someone who's in charge of journalism in my program. This is what I do with my students and with my faculty is, I want to create queens on a chessboard. I want to create journalists who can do anything. I want people who can go out, they can talk to any type of group of people. They can investigate any type of story. They can do things in writing form, in visual form, in audio form. They can tackle topics that are controversial. They can work on stories that they might personally disagree with. If a story needs to be told, go tell it without complaining that I disagree with this topic, or I don't like that person. No, here's the story. Go find the truth of what's happening. And that's what we do in my program. And so these schools that are focusing on subjectivity and thinking you can be accurate and factual and truthful without being objective is quite ridiculous. And the thing that's most ridiculous about it is we don't do this in other areas of life. Okay, we don't. If you're a medical doctor, your job is to be objective. Your job is to look at your patient and diagnose him or her from a variety of perspectives based on what might be best for that individual patient. It's not just to go along with what you've always done. It's not to treat that person as a certain skin color, or to treat that person as your skin color or your political point of view or whatever it is. All of that needs to be thrown out the window. When you are doing your job, you're doing the job, which means how can I help my patient as fairly and truthfully and accurately as possible? That's what medical doctors are supposed to do. It's what judges are supposed to do. Juries have their own biases, of course, because they're human beings, but the goal of a jury is to try to be objective. That's what a court case does, is to present the facts from both sides. But a judge, when he or she has the robes on, that's the job. Look at this case fairly as best you can. Accountants, you don't get to make the math work however you want just based on your lived experience. You have to calculate your credits and debits, your profits and losses accurately with as fine a tooth comb as you can so that you're following the law and doing what's best for your company. So whether it's science, medicine, accounting, judges, science in general, this way of thinking that they're promoting is anti-science. And we've seen that the last couple of years, which is we don't need both sidesism because there's only one answer. It's the answer that we all think we agree with. Well, that's not science. The whole point of science, just like the whole point of journalism, is to see if you can go prove yourself wrong. Go investigate, because the further you look into it and the more sides you look at it from, the more opportunities you might be wrong. Maybe your assumptions and your biases were incorrect. You perceived the world one way, and the further you looked into it, you realized you were wrong. You need to change your story. That's the whole point of science, and that's the point of journalism. Even the classroom as a teacher, my job is to be objective. Yeah, I have my own view because of my own upbringing and experience and worldview and all that stuff, but I don't treat different students differently. I don't teach differently based on who I'm talking to. Whatever goal I'm having, whether it's teaching writing or a piece of literature or a piece of journalism or whatever it might be, it's to present it as fairly as I possibly can. I've taught at public universities. And when I was in those situations, even though I have my own, my own worldview, my job at those public places was I never want my students to know my perspective. I don't bring my identity to me with the classroom, in the classroom. I present all sides fairly. So if we're talking about some current event or controversial topic, because we're working on a persuasive essay or whatever it is we were doing, or whether it's a story, in a journalism environment where we're trying to break down the facts of a case or whatever. We're looking at this thing from both sides fairly. I always ask students, not always, but I would often, if there were particular semesters where controversial topics came up that we were trying to get to the bottom of and do some research on, things like that, I would ask them, among a variety of questions at the end of the semester, how the semester went, what did they learn, whatever. Hey, what political ideology do you believe the teacher has, meaning me? And what I would always aim for was no one would know. Half the class would say one thing, half the class would say the other thing, and I'd go, perfect. That's what I wanted, because I was being objective. I don't want anyone to know what I think personally about a topic, because that's not serving the students. My job is to train them to think about things from all sides. That's the definition of thinking critically. All right, that's sort of the buzzword in academia the last 20 years is we got to get kids to think critically. That means thinking of things from a variety of angles, as deeply as possible and challenging your own assumptions. trying to constantly prove yourself wrong in the traditional scientific method. That's the job. And so in all these fields, again, medicine, science, accounting, teaching, the law, we need to be objective so that people can then, whoever we're influencing, they can decide what they want to do with it. But my job is not to indoctrinate people with my own worldview in a public setting anyway, like these major media and journalistic enterprises or in government. Your job is to investigate the facts from all sides. That's what we do. And again, we've seen this the last couple of years really bite us in the backside, because look at all the things that have happened that we thought were one thing because that's what journalists told us, and turned out to be completely the opposite. When everyone said, oh, you can't disagree with information about COVID because we all agree it's one thing. Well, it's turned out that most of those things were completely wrong. Whereas if we would have been objective and truly aiming at accuracy and fairness from all sides, well, we could have had a legitimate debate about that 3 years ago, and we didn't. And look what happened. Whether it's the Hunter Biden laptop, which everyone said, oh, everyone knows we don't need both sidesism here. There's only one side. This was a hoax. This isn't real. Anyone who is on another side is a conspiracy theorist. Well, now it's turned out it was exactly what everyone thought it was, or the people on the other side thought it was. It was his. He admitted it. There's all sorts of weird stuff that if we would have just been objective, we could have tried to figure this out and get at the truth sooner. Stuff this week with January 6th, also with the Twitter files, footage being released, stuff with Ukraine, whatever it is, all of these topics that we keep hearing from mainstream media sources saying, we don't need both sidesism because this is settled science. This is settled reporting. It's like, no, there's all sorts of sides to this. And legitimate, smart, intelligent people from the opposing side or a different side, doesn't even have to be in opposition, but just an adjacent, a different side, could provide clarity on this topic. And yet, because we think we don't need both sidesism, that led us to having a uniform, propagandistic form of journalism that ended up being largely inaccurate. And so if you're concerned about misinformation and disinformation, this document is the problem, because we're not hiring people, we're not training people in our colleges to truly be fair-minded, critical thinking journalists. And that's a problem. So hopefully I've covered enough of it so that you don't have to slog through it the way I did, because it was not an enjoyable read. Like I said, it's not very well written. It's quite contradictory. It's not sourced very well in the text anyway. So it's really not great. But now you know what's going on. This is at a major university, a major school of journalism. And this is what we're teaching our young people about going into the field of journalism. As I said, I teach it differently in my program. I have standards for my faculty that I hire, and how we run our classrooms and what we expect of our students. So if you prefer or are interested in more trying to get back to objectivity the best we can, acknowledging that, it's not going to always be perfect, but that's the goal, is we're aiming at, true fairness and accuracy and truth discovery. That's what we do. We don't advocate positions when we're doing news anyway. Again, opinion journalism, human interest style, op-ed stuff, that's all fine. But if you're doing news, we do it the right way. And if you want to learn more about it, shoot me an email, let me know in the comments, because this is the challenge we're up against. Major schools basically saying that being fair and truly examining things from all sides is no longer a tenable way of doing journalism. And I just disagree. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for listening. Join us next time for more English Champion.